There's a question that I often go over in my head, and that question is what motivates people most of all, really more than anything? I mean, over time, philosophers have come up with things like meaning. We go for things that give us purpose, even if they hurt. Or a few of them have said pleasure. We actually tie that into the idea that things are useful. Things that please us are things that are useful to us, and vice versa. Things that feel bad are not useful. And then some people just say the purpose of life is picking up hotties. Personally, I think it's habit. We become what we're used to. And a funny thing about my philosophy that a lot of people agree with actually is that habit makes us lazy. And that, in fact, laziness is the same thing as habit. It's good to do things automatically because then we don't have to think about them. The downside of this, of course, is that we become, well, we become susceptible to a few things. One of them is getting the idea that we don't have to think about what's around us in the world. For example, the messages that are in our society every day, the things that we are constantly told to believe. Another one is that when we're told to do something important, it slips our mind, unless it's right there in front of us. That saying, out of sight, out of mind, it really defines us, I think. The reason I bring this up is because I've had a great big swell in my numbers lately, and a lot of you seem to have come from the friendlyjordies channel after my last video answering people's questions from the perspective of an ex-journalist, someone who has controlled the message and had access to the message, someone in that great position of privilege where you actually, honestly, it is a power of life and death at times, which is terrifying, and we've become very good at not thinking about it. And the real reason I bring this up is because friendlyjordies is always telling the viewer to read this one book. It's by two men named Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky. It's called Manufacturing Consent. And chances are you haven't gotten around to it because, hey, that's just the habit you're in. It's not necessarily that you're lazy, or maybe it is that you're lazy and that's not a bad thing. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and explain it to you. I'm just going to break down that one very important chapter that everyone recommends this book to you because of. This is the playbook for propaganda. When someone says to you, man, everything is just owned by the media these days, or like the media controls the government, when so many of us assume that it's the other way around. People may say to you, man, it's all about fear these days. It's all fear-based marketing. It's all fear-based news. That's a very vague thing, and chances are you don't know what the hell they're on about. But actually it makes a lot of sense when you understand the motivation of media systems and the big megaphones that are around you in the world. I'm talking about the really grand stuff, like the big mastheads of the major newspapers. I'm talking about the political ads. When you literally put a politician on a podium, what are they giving you? What are they trying to put into your head? What direction are they subtly leading you into? And that thing about subtlety is really important because that's how it works in our society. The thing to understand about propaganda is that it can work against the law at times, or it can become the law. It's this little flexible thing that decides what our habits are and what our ideas are, right down to what our morals are in a society. So it may bring you, say, guilt and shame. It may bring you pleasure. It may bring you excitement for something new. But propaganda, it always gets you in the feels, and often it does this by getting you in the reason. It appeals to your logic to try and swell up something inside you so that you get into the habit of living by a certain moral code. The way this happens in our society, first you have to understand how it works in totalitarian societies. So there are two main types of propaganda that Chomsky lays out in this book, because this propaganda chapter was written by Noam Chomsky specifically, and I encourage you to check him out. He's this just fascinating, he's an anarchist figure actually. He's by trade an English professor, and he's done incredible things in that regard. He's done excellent work predicting the grammar of entire languages. But what we're focusing on here is his fascination with how language is used to control people. So he really laid this out in an international way. And he began by pointing out the totalitarian. I always have trouble with that word. The totalitarian tendency toward propaganda, which is that it's really blunt. You know, the government controls the message, and if you have a problem with them, then they can have you killed. So they will outright say, okay, these are the bad guys now. Don't give them your business. Ignore them. Just, in fact, you can shoot them if you want. A recent example of this is Duterte's Philippines, where they actually do shoot drug dealers. Tens of thousands have been killed, but the average person seems to be okay with it. It could be their own child one day. And nonetheless, they've decided that this is what cleans up the streets. This is what makes everything right. In a free society, the propaganda is a little bit more subtle. Instead of outright saying, hey, get rid of these guys, you may be encouraged to boycott a company because they said the wrong thing. You may be encouraged to vote for a certain person. In fact, you will be encouraged to vote for a certain person in subtle ways. And we're going to get into that a little bit. In fact, I'm going to make a ton of videos about this because you need to understand the basics, and I'm going to try and make it short and interesting, but there's actually a lot to it. The other subtle way in which they do this is that they give you the idea that you have chosen your opinion, that you are part of this community. Perhaps they'll get you through your political identity. In fact, it can be even your voting lineage. Say, you know, my parents voted Labour, my parents voted Conservative, and their parents before them did, and my grandchildren after me shall as well. In fact, they can get you through your sport. And so many of us do treat politics like a spectator sport, you know, like the football. This is our team. I have to stick by them no matter what, which is quite bad for you if you think about it, because this is your future. This is your the system of policy in which you live. You could be living in this working class background, this working class suburb, and maybe through that sport team, you know, you're encouraged to back the social causes that go with it. Whether it be, you know, going to work and the newspaper. For example, the Herald Sun gives out a lot of their newspapers for free to cafes, to workplaces, to schools even. And someone there might say, oh, have you read so-and-so? You know, I can't believe our local member has let in this refugee family. Or I can't believe our local member has raised taxes. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. You know, I can't believe we're a true blue, you know, this color kind of people. The Herald Sun in particular is a very big football newspaper. So you'll be reading the sport pages, and then you'll flip innocuously, what is going on with me today, toward the first page. And the first page will have some very strong political opinions. I've covered this in other videos, why this is. But the moral of the story is that you're being guided toward a certain ideology. So Chomsky has laid out those two ideologies and how they dominate their respective countries. And then he does something really cheeky. He says that this is how governments control all the news that's fit to print. Now, the reason this is so funny is because when the New York Times came out, the media was a lot like the way it is at the moment. We had what was called yellow journalism, where people would say pretty much whatever, and you could get away with lying because people would assume that you would lie. But this was really bad for them, because when you pick up a newspaper, you need news that's relevant to you. You need to know what's happening in your street. You need to know what might burn down next week. You need to know which companies have built shoddy towers. For example, a tower in Miami in the United States just collapsed, and they're beginning to talk about it. They're looking at other towers created by that company and saying, okay, should the presidents move out? Should we modify this a little bit? And that's what public interest does. Public interest, by definition, is what people need to know right now. And so at the end of the 1800s, the New York Times comes along, and it has this little tagline on the front page, all the news that's fit to print. Chomsky has actually said, well, I don't know about that. I mean, what you decide is fit to print might have gone through a couple of little filters, you know? Maybe the person who owns the newspaper has had a little bit of say and taken out a few things. Maybe the top advertisers have done a little bit more, right down to who's our enemy at the moment? Who can't we talk about? What names can't we mention without people assuming that we're about to say something bad? And this is where the 5 filters come in. 1. Ownership. 2. Funding. 3. Authority. It has a longer title, but I'm just going to use the word authority. 4. Flak. And 5. Fear. Although the original title was anti-communism. More on that later. So the first filter, ownership, is all about who runs this particular press. It's funny, there's a book from the 60s called Steal This Book by Abby Hoffman, and true to its name, it absolutely flew off shelves, but no one ever paid for it. And he used to say in that book, now there's an old saying, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one. But if you don't have that much money, you can go make your own pamphlets. The truth is, it's not quite that simple, because there is, I hate using this word, but the populists do have it right. There is a cabal of mainstream media that kind of plays with governments and other institutions of power. Those other estates. The other estates are businesses and basically the religious institutions, the things that you can't question in society. And you have to kind of be nice to those people, otherwise you don't quite get comment from them. They may not let you into their conferences, or those times when we literally put the politician on the podium. And as well as that, the owners of the media organizations themselves have a lot of decisions. Not just the people who own the company, but like the senior staff. It actually does happen to be the middle management who have an enormous amount of power over which stories go ahead, which ones don't go ahead, what angles you take to certain issues. And it's true that the owners, well, they handpick these people for their opinions and for the angles that they'll take. But it always comes down to that person who is listed in the newspaper itself as editor or sub-editor. Like so many companies, the middle management decides what rules go. The next one is funding. Now, in the mainstream media, this looks like your advertisers. If there's, for example, a giant Harvey Norman banner at the bottom of page 1, you know that they can't insult that company because that company will pull its funding. And in Australia, at least, this is the reality that one company, obviously I can't say too much because I've got all these viewers now. You've kind of ruined my political immunity here. I can't say certain things or I'll get sued, which will come down to the Flak section, which we'll get to in a minute. The biggest advertiser in the country has quite a lot of power over what is said and what isn't said. And its people, to an extent, are protected in the media, the mainstream media anyway. This has to be updated, and I'll be talking in future videos about the updates that have to come with technology and other things like that to this propaganda model. But one of the big ones is, of course, the media has fragmented and we have ways of getting our message out there. Abby Hoffman was a little bit right when he said you can make your own press, because we have things like YouTube or Medium where you can write your own message, but these are all controlled by big companies. And these companies can kick you off pretty much whenever they like. So you're actually beholden to a very small pool of people. These are the upper management of that company on whose platform you're creating the thing. So for example, in previous videos, I went and said, oh, I can't say certain things. I think most recently it was calling Clive Palmer a fatty McFuckhead, in my opinion. But I've come to realize that I might have to shift my own model for making videos so that I can say these things openly, because otherwise you're not exactly getting a well-rounded education here. And, you know, education is very protected under our media laws, particularly copyright. So fun fact for you if you want to try this for yourself. A very good example of this is Amazon. All the novelists are turning away from the mainstream publishing at the moment, and I'm actually doing the same thing. You put your own books on a medium where it can get to people and where you can push it in your own way. The biggest one right now is Amazon, but of course there are those allegations of, you know, urine in jars and people working 1,000-hour days, and you do feel a little bit grubby doing that, but more importantly for our purposes here, They get to say what you can and can't do, and in fact they can kind of pull your funding at will. And this is a common problem for people on that platform. Their money disappears one day and they have to deal with customer service. But customer service is a part of that machine. Filter 3 is authority. Now we've talked about those middle managers and the people who kind of control things. This is where reporters get a little bit more power. Now, if you go to the middle of an article thereabouts, often you'll see an expert that they've brought in to explain how this issue works. During COVID, if you go to a lot of those articles, they'll get an immunologist. And now a fun game to play is to go to different newspapers, different websites, and look at the names. Often you'll see a lot of these publications using the same 2 or 3 names. And so you get this kind of oligarchy of people who are very powerful and actually get to control the message because they have the message handed to them, essentially, by the major organizations involved. And this extends to saying, okay, you're the big journalist, we're going to let you have the big story. Or for example, in Australia, our most highly paid journalists are opinion columnists who have these opinions that coincidentally seem to line up with what the mainstream outlets really want to have pushed out there. And they tend to line up with the politicians who are nicest to them when creating reform, when putting changes to the law out there that will benefit that particular newspaper. So the authority filter is actually the power to say whom we take seriously and whom we don't. The 4th filter is Flak. This one's really interesting. The name comes from around World War II, if you watch those old movies, and you see fighter jets, well, the equivalent of fighter jets back then, flying through the air, and there'll be these big puffs of black smoke. These were actually weapons being fired at them that would spread all these little fragments through the air and would stop basically everything that was coming toward them. So Flak works in a couple of ways. One is you take the offensive. So these are your hit pieces. These are ridicule, actually. This is something I'm going to point out a lot in this channel because it's a very big deal these days. If you laugh at someone, you can actually disarm them. You can make their message impotent. And you're going to see this a lot in politics. Go watch your local parliament, congress, whichever country you're in, your local question time, where you get to see the politicians speaking out. And a lot of them will be making jokes at each other's expense in a way that we didn't necessarily see back in the day. And this is because it's a very good, subtle method of control. If you can stop taking someone else seriously in a system where you only have so many people to vote for, then you don't have much other choice, do you? And a lot of people feel this way on election day. You know, well, I can't vote for anyone else, so I guess I'll go for this person. And the other way, of course, is defense, which is a little bit of an inoculation. You see a lot of negotiating tactics, actually, in propaganda. A favorite of mine is that you kind of disqualify what you're about to say, where it's like, okay, you're going to think I'm awful. You're going to think that I'm absolutely ripping you off here. And then you put out something that's not actually all that bad, something reasonable that they'll at least come close to agreeing to. And media does this in a lot of ways. You may have heard something called Betteridge's Law. Betteridge's Law is a little something that was made up on the internet, but has very much come true. The idea is that if an article asks a question, the answer is no. Go try it out right now. If you're in Australia, the ABC website has been using a lot of these new clickbaity titles. It's unfortunate, you know, it's a result of losing a lot of funding and putting new people in those middle manager positions, and they've been told to write these clickbait articles, but you can see a lot of Betteridge's Law at work there. The other ones are The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. They've been using this technique as well. Just go look for an article with a question in it. And filter number 5 is fear, originally anti-communism because the book was written during the Cold War. This one needs quite a few updates, but the gist of it is we assume when we see certain words in the media that it's going to be negative. One of them at the moment is Islam, Muslims, etc. Another one is protesters. We assume that the paper is about to tell us that they're looters, that they're rioters, that there are some other things that much less put forward in good faith. And actually not too much has changed, because you'll see Marxists as well, often used by people who don't know the meaning of the word. And that's generally how you can tell that you're being emotionally fed something to feel. You can see logical fallacies in it. Or in fact, you can see that this was written by someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. And the average person can casually disagree with someone. We can respectfully disagree. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy reading things that I disagree with, because it gets my brain going. Even if we may avoid these things in two-way media, for example, social media, because it makes us feel attacked. But if you pick up a newspaper and hate read a column by someone who you just think is the worst, it's euphoric. And so those are the 5 things you have to know as we wade through the ocean of piss that is 21st century messaging. 1, ownership. Who runs the show? 2, funding. Who's paying for this? Propaganda isn't cheap, no matter how you look at it. 3, authority. Who do we take seriously? Who don't we take seriously? 4, flak. Who are we going for? Who's going for us? And what are we doing about it? And 5, fear. Who's the boogeyman?